Good evening. I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to Conversations in the Digital Age. Tonight's show is about the Arab Spring, also known as the Arab uprisings. 3 years later, how are things stacking up in the Middle East region? With us tonight is an expert on the Middle East. She is Isobel Coleman. Isobel Coleman is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she has traveled extensively in the region and written books and articles about the Middle East. Isobel, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
Now, this whole thing started in December of 2010 when a young 26-year-old street vendor in Tunisia named Mohammed Bouazizi immolated himself, suicided, because he felt humiliated by a local official. Now, why did that touch off uprisings and revolutions throughout the region?
Well, Mohammed Bouazizi setting himself on fire was, of course, the proximate reason for the Arab uprisings. And I'm going to use the term Arab uprisings. I've never liked the term Arab Spring.
Well, first, let me ask about that. What does Arab Spring mean?
Well, I think spring.
Is it spring like the season? It
spring
didn't happen.
Connotes, a moment of rebirth, and it's a limited period that's followed by a summer that things grow and develop, and
or it might mean spring forward, and
well, in the case of the Arab revolutions, it's not been short and sweet, and it hasn't always gone forward. So I don't like the term spring, but Arab uprisings, Arab revolutions, and the only thing I would say is, well, Mohammed Bouazizi was the proximate spark. It didn't actually start then. The roots of it go back many years. I mean, there had been efforts at reform, at mobilizing, at getting people to engage for years prior to December of 2011. Why did it happen in 2011? Who knows? It was no doubt a combination of factors. Undoubtedly, the mass street protests, the people power that erupted around Mohammed Bouazizi's immolation, and then, of course, were organized and erupted and carried forward in Egypt, and then a little bit later in Libya, Syria, Yemen. All of these things were interconnected. People in one country were looking at what happened in another. It was infectious. You had the medium of modern communications, the internet, Facebook, Twitter, all of these things propelling it. But you also had some years of real organization that had gone into building opposition movements, building people power, in effect, in these countries. I think, of course, one of the things that was so shocking is that the regime in Tunisia was always thought of as the ultimate police state. I mean, you didn't get away with anything in Ben Ali's Tunisia without his secret police knowing about it, without him cracking down pretty hard on it. This was no light touch regime. And the fact that it fell so quickly, I think, took people not just by surprise. It was shocking, and it really inspired people in other countries to say, well, if Ben Ali is not going to fight it out, if the military and the security forces are not going to fire on the people in Tunisia, maybe we have a chance here in Egypt, in Syria, in Yemen, and in Libya.
Well, Ben Ali left Tunisia with his family about a month after the immolation, and he, of course, was an autocrat, a dictator, and as was his predecessor, Bourguiba, whom he ousted from office. But where are things now in Tunisia? Have they made any progress as a result of this transformation?
Well, they've certainly made progress in Tunisia. Has it been short and sweet? No, not at all. Tunisia remains the country with still, I think, the best shot at getting through this turbulence and coming out on the other side in a system that's far more representative, far more open, inclusive, but it still has enormous challenges. So what you see in Tunisia today is a process of elections that have occurred. They elected a parliament. The Islamists in that parliament did not gain a majority, but they gained a plurality. They formed a coalition. They've been working now on writing a constitution. That constitutional process has dragged on and on. There's a lot of tension in society between Islamists and secularists. It has erupted into violence at times. You've had some politically motivated assassinations starting in the spring, the late winter, spring of this year, with the assassination of one of the leading opposition figures, Shukri Belaid. And that really was a turning point, an inflection point, a negative inflection point in Tunisia's transition, where secularists and opposition groups saying, you, the Islamists, the dominant Islamist party, the Nada party, you're not taking seriously enough our concerns, and you're also not dealing seriously enough with the Islamist challenge, the violent Islamist challenge that Tunisia is facing. And you saw that really erupt last fall with the sacking of the American embassy in Tunisia. Again, another negative inflection point, turning point in Tunisia's transition.
Well, another thing that's happened there is the new president, Ben Ali's successor, Mr. Marzouki, has written a book, a black book, in which he really seeks to purge Ben Ali's closest associates. How is that going to play out?
Well, again, this is one of those other points of contention and friction in Tunisia, and it's also taking place in other countries around the region that are going through transition. In Libya in particular, you've seen this issue play out. Anybody associated with the Gaddafi regime, the people now in power want to completely sideline them. And some of them, there's good reason to, and others, you can see political rivalries today playing out, wanting to sideline anybody who might be a political rival. So they're drafting laws in such a way that it prohibits people from running in elections if they had even the most tangential relationship to the previous regime. And after all, most of your talented class of professionals in one way or another had some association with the previous regime.
Kind of a Thermidorian reaction.
There's a Thermidorian reaction in all of this.
Now, well, we'll get to the French Revolution later, but after Tunisia, the next country to become bestirred in the Arab uprisings was Egypt. Now, what's going on there? It's the largest Muslim country in the world.
Before we leave Tunisia, just one more thing. I mean, Tunisia is muddling through a political process. It does have a constitution. It's not a bad constitution, the drafts that I've seen. It's a pretty good constitution, but it does have these deep divisions still in society. But ultimately, Tunisia's main issue is still economic. It's what motivated Mohamed Bouazizi to set himself on fire in the first place. And this is a theme across the regions. As they're struggling through these political transitions, their economies are adrift. So Egypt, what's going on there? Well, you've seen counter-revolution in Egypt. You had such remarkable hope and idealism on the streets of Tahrir when the revolution started.
You were there.
I happened to be there, indeed. Just coincidentally, I was in Egypt at that time. I knew that something was coming. You could see, we'd been reading the papers, and I knew that after Tunisia, there were big demonstrations planned. Could I predict that Mubarak would be gone in 3 weeks? No, it was breathtaking and shocking, but after Ben Ali, not inconceivable. So in Egypt, you've seen, again, a process of elections. In Egypt's case, the Islamists actually got a majority. The Muslim Brotherhood got a
terrorist organization.
Got a slight majority, just over 50%. And then when you add in the more conservative Salafi parties, it was over 70% of the vote in the parliamentary elections. And then in the presidential election, you saw the Muslim Brotherhood come back around with their presidential candidate, Mohamed Morsi, getting just over 50% of the vote. Sorry, in the parliamentary elections, they got around 40% of the vote, and the Islamists brought them up to a majority.
Okay, so Morsi gets in, and when he got in, because he was the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood, we weren't so crazy about him, but then it turned out the Egyptian people weren't so crazy about him either when he proclaimed himself as a pharaoh a year later.
I guess buyer's remorse. I mean, the majority of people voted for him, but he acted in a very autocratic fashion. He pushed through a number of legislative changes that added to his power. And the United States really said nothing. It was on the heels of positive intervention by Morsi in the Gaza imbroglio that was going on at that time, and he played a positive role in a ceasefire and helping to negotiate that, and then turned right around. This is in November of last year, and gave himself additional powers. And, you know, the people in Egypt began to get queasy about, are we seeing another pharaoh here? You also saw a constitutional process in Egypt that really has differed from what has gone on in Tunisia. In Tunisia, there's been an effort to try to be more inclusive. The Nada party, the leading Islamist party in Tunisia, made a very critical decision. We're not going to push Sharia in the constitution. We recognize that we have a country that's going to make some people really move against us. In Egypt, you didn't see that type of restraint from the Brotherhood. If anything, you saw the Brotherhood overreaching. They said in the beginning, for the parliamentary elections, we'll hold back. They didn't. They ran a large number of candidates. They got over 40% of the vote. Then you saw, well, we won't run a presidential candidate. Change our mind. We will run a presidential candidate and we'll win. And they did that. And then with the Constitution, they really pushed through a number of articles in the Constitution that elevated Islam. Islam has always been in the Egyptian Constitution, but it gave it a much more prominent role.
Okay, but now they've torpedoed that Constitution, and in 2 years they're drafting a second Constitution.
In 1 year.
In 1 year.
In 1 year.
1 year, two constitutions.
Well, they didn't actually torpedo the last Constitution. They took it and they've revised it. So they've taken out the most contentious articles around Islam, but they've left in Article 2, which still leaves Islam as very central to Egyptian constitutional law. So,
but don't they outlaw religious parties in the new Constitution?
They have, and they've taken...
Will that include the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood has in the past been outlawed also, and yet they've been able to run under Mubarak. As a party, they were outlawed, but they were able to run candidates in elections as independents. Everybody knew they were the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, but they were still able to, as independents, you know, get on the ballot and achieve political influence that way. So there's a question.
Yeah, but the new Constitution affirms rights of religious freedom, does it not?
It does.
Also affirms certain rights for women and women's equality.
It expands women's rights. It affirms freedom of religion, but it also gives a lot more power to the military, which makes people uncomfortable, and it restricts the ability of people to demonstrate, to mobilize. It restricts the actions of civil society in general, and that's a negative thing in the Constitution.
Because there's no buffer against the government, whatever it is.
There's no counterweight. Yeah. You've seen the people play a very powerful, influential role in Egypt as a counterweight to the government, as a counterweight to the Mubarak government, as a counterweight to the Morsi government, and their ability to play that counterweight role to now this military-backed government will be more limited. And
despite the fact it's a military-backed government and overthrew a democratically elected regime, we continue to pump about $1.5 billion annually in foreign aid there. Most of it goes to the military, and yet their economy is in collapse.
Well, their economy actually isn't in collapse, and the reason it's not in collapse is because what we give them is small fry. The Gulf countries have stepped in and given them tens of billions of dollars, which is artificially propping up their economy. They have literally deposited billions of dollars in the Egyptian central bank to stabilize the currency, and they have given the Egyptians billions in money to provide for heating oil and oil and food and other things that are literally propping up the economy.
The Saudis have weighed in behind the military regime, haven't they? Which much to
strongly.
Yes, much to the displeasure of the Muslim Brotherhood. Do you think that's going to make the Muslim Brotherhood anti-monarchical in other countries, particularly in Saudi?
Well, the reason the Saudis weighed in with the military against the Muslim Brotherhood is because they've long disliked the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood has been anti-monarchical. They have been against the Saudi monarchy.
But they did support Morsi before the fall.
They were very hesitant and reluctant on Morsi. If anything, the Saudis put a lot of money behind the Salafi groups to try to counter, provide an Islamist counter to the Muslim Brotherhood. They have long disliked the Muslim Brotherhood and long restricted the Brotherhood's activities within the kingdom. They fear the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood is a potential opposition to them in Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Let's move on to Libya. You mentioned Libya. What's going on there?
Well, Libya has enormous potential. It's a small country. It's only got 6 million people.
Lots of oil.
Tons of oil. Tons of money in sovereign wealth funds and in offshore equities and everything else. But it's a relatively well-educated population. I mean, Egypt, as you said, is a country of 85, 90 million people, very high illiteracy rates, low levels of education. Libya, you know, small population relatively, well-educated relatively. Its big issue is security. So you're seeing the rumblings of civil war in that country. You had militias from various tribes and from different geographies of the country come together to overthrow Gaddafi. But the minute that result was achieved, that unanimity, actually there never really was any unanimity, but that concerted effort quickly resulted in divisions. And you've seen geographic divisions between the East and the West. The East of the country always feeling as if they are the poor brother, even though there's a lot of oil in the East. A lot of disgruntled feeling in the city of Benghazi around that area. And you have tribal differences. You have southern tribal groups. You have just various militias that have formed and are refusing to demilitarize. And they've, in fact, taken over control of the country in many ways. You have militias manning highways, militias manning entry points to cities. Militias even kidnapped briefly Ali Zaidan, the prime minister, in October. They took him hostage, and another militia came in and freed him. So where's the government in all of this? There really isn't one.
And indeed, the militias shuttered the oil terminals for a while, didn't they?
Yeah,
they're now reopening them.
They are, but this is, again, one of these points of leverage that the militias have, is to turn on and off the oil. Libya will live or die on its oil in the foreseeable future. It's the vast majority of its revenues comes from oil.
It's desert plus oil.
It's desert plus oil and people. You know, it does have
yes.
It does have a remarkable human capital. You have a lot of very talented Libyans who, over the years, have left the country, and they've become very successful in Europe and the United States and Canada. And they're eager to go back. They're eager to go back and rebuild their country, to rebuild it economically, rebuild it socially, civically, politically. But until there is some sense made of the security situation, that's not going to happen. You also see the rise of not just militias, but jihadi groups. I mean, it's become almost untenable there.
Failed state.
I wouldn't say a failed state, not yet, but something needs to change pretty significantly to avoid a failed state. And you do have the Europeans and the United States recognizing that it's reaching a crisis proportion and stepping in, trying to train up a government force, a military that can be used in a more unified national way. But the problem, that solution isn't really addressing the problem. The problem ultimately is a political problem. The country needs a constitution. It hasn't even begun drafting its constitution. And it needs some type of reconciliation and some type of agreement on power sharing that's actually going to hold the different parts together.
Now, we moved west, now let's move east. What about Yemen? Yemen, the president, Saleh, said he was going to resign after the demonstrations. Then he refused to resign. He reneged on his agreement, and they tried to assassinate him. They grievously wounded him. And now, finally, he's out of power, but it would appear. But what's going on there?
Well, Yemen is going through its own turbulent transition. It has a new government. It is trying to go through a transitional phase, but you also in Yemen have a number of conflicts. You have conflicts between Islamists and secularists. You have conflicts between the North and the South that over the years has resulted in civil war in that country, and in fact, division into two different countries, North Yemen and South Yemen, and then reunification. You have an ongoing insurgency in the north, the Houthis fighting against the government, and there's evidence of outside involvement. Some have said that Iran has been backing Houthi opposition groups. The Saudis have been involved because it's right on the Saudi border. And then on top of all of this, you have a real stagnation and deep-seated problems in the Yemeni economy. And a lot of Yemenis work in the Gulf, and in particular in Saudi, their northern neighbor. You've had a very porous border there. And right now the Saudis are forcing hundreds of thousands, up to 2 million Yemeni workers to return to Yemen because they don't want them in the country anymore. So on top of the political situation, you have a very dire economic situation in Yemen. And it is the poorest country in the region.
Is Yemen a failed state?
I wouldn't go so far as to say a failed state. You actually have a pretty resilient national dialogue process that is going on. So they're talking to each other. I mean, during 2011, you had generals pointing guns at each other, and it looked like you might see full-blown civil war, and there was talk of a failed state. But here we are, nearly 3 years on in Yemen, and I'm actually more hopeful about Yemen because it hasn't gone in the most negative direction that we feared back in the dark days of 2011. And you do have these parties at least talking to each other and trying to work out their differences through a political process.
Well, save the best for last. Syria. We have 126,000 dead in the civil war. Perhaps 2 million refugees have been absorbed by neighboring countries. We seem to have some kind of a détente with the deal on chemical weapons, and now there's supposed to be talks in Geneva. Well, what do you think is going to happen there?
Well, Syria is one of those cases that's going to get worse, I think, before it gets worse. And it's just a very dire situation. You have one of the most tragic humanitarian crises that we've seen in modern times. I mean, really, it's awful. I think the best hope for Syria is some type of political reconciliation not reconciliation, but political deal that will have to involve Iran, it will have to involve Russia, it'll have to involve Saudi and the United States, the outside powers that are involved in this situation. And of course,
we were about to be involved, or the president wanted to be involved. He went to Congress, but just in the nick of time, the Russians came in and saved his bacon. But
I mean, not directly involved with boots on the ground or flying, airstrikes, but we are involved regardless, even if our involvement is to try to restrain monies going to certain opposition groups. I mean,
well, you have Al-Qaeda there among the opposition of the regime, and we certainly don't want them to flourish. And,
you certainly do. And
particularly not on U.S. money.
I think there's a perspective gaining ground in Washington that for all of Bashar al-Assad's evils, that some of the opposition groups look worse, and we're not so sure we want to see Bashar disappear overnight. And so figuring out and leaving a vacuum in the country that is filled by some of the more extremist jihadi groups.
Well, if we wind up weighing in on the side of Assad.
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, but we certainly seem to be leaning in that direction because of the presence of Al-Qaeda, and then doesn't that give us problems with the Saudis?
Of course. I mean, this has been the main friction point between U.S. and Saudi has been over Syria and over Iran. And they are related. It is the Iranians who are backing Bashar al-Assad with weapons, with fighters, with money, in all sorts of ways that has deepened this fight enormously.
Now, the Iranians indicated some willingness to break with Assad. They said that they would welcome the chance to participate in the Geneva meetings about a possible resolution of the fighting. So how do they figure in the whole thing?
Geneva's been on the table for a year, and Geneva ultimately is a political solution, or an attempt at a political solution, and it's never gotten off the ground because there has been no space for that political solution. There's no seen eye to eye between Saudi, Iran, Russia, the United States on any of these issues. But there could be going forward. I mean, I think that's the only glimmer of hope for Syria, is that the Iranians decide that it's too much for them, too much money, too much blood, treasure, and that it's not worth it, and they back off, and that leads to some type of transition, a political transition.
Okay, we have to wind up, but I have a question for you. You remember Zhou Enlai famously said, when he was asked about the impact of the French Revolution, he said it's too early
to tell.
So I ask you, Isobel Coleman, what is the impact of the Arab Spring?
Too early to tell.
Too early to tell. Thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you.
That's wonderful, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations on the digital age. For the digital age, for Conversations of the Digital Age, I'm Jim Zirin. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. Good night and all the best.